A man sat on a metal bench inside the Rikers Island intake hall, staring at the tray they had just slid through the slot. On it was a single slice of processed cheese between two pieces of bread, so stale they cracked when he picked them up. Beside it, a carton of milk already warm. That was dinner, and that was one of the better nights. Number 18 on this list involves a meal so foul that guards themselves refused to walk near the serving line. Number 11 was not served by the facility at all, and number 1 was not food by any definition most people would recognize. Hit subscribe, because what happened inside the kitchens of the largest jail complex in the United States will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about how this country feeds its prisoners. Here are 25 shocking meals actually served to prisoners at Rikers Island. Number 25. The intake sandwich. Every person who arrived at Rikers got the same welcome: 2 slices of white bread, 1 slice of bologna, and a packet of yellow mustard. No lettuce, no tomato, nothing else. The bread was usually stale, sometimes days old, pulled from bulk bags that sat stacked in hallways before anyone thought to distribute them. For many detainees, this was the first thing they ate after spending hours, sometimes more than a full day, wading through processing in holding cells with no vending machines and no water fountains. It did not matter if they had a medical condition or a dietary restriction. It did not matter if they had not eaten since the morning before their arrest. Everyone got the same sandwich, and for thousands of people over the decades, that sandwich was the first taste of what Rikers had in store. Number 24. Warm milk cartons. Rikers served small cartons of milk with nearly every meal. The problem was temperature. Milk was pulled from refrigeration and loaded onto carts, but those carts often sat in corridors and staging areas for long stretches before reaching the housing units. By the time inmates received them, the cartons were warm to the touch and sometimes already turning sour. Former detainees described a smell that hit you before you even opened the carton. Many poured it straight down the sink. The ones who drank it did so because it was the only source of calcium they would see that day. Others held onto the carton and used it to trade in the housing unit, warm or not, because even bad milk had value when the alternative was nothing. Number 23. Mystery meat patties. The lunch trays at Rikers frequently included a brown disc the facility called a meat patty. Inmates called it something else entirely. The texture was spongy, the color was uniform in a way that real ground beef never is, and it carried a faint chemical aftertaste that lingered on the tongue for hours. These patties were made from a processed soy and meat blend designed to meet minimum protein requirements at the lowest possible cost per serving. When you bit into one, it crumbled rather than tore. No seasoning was added. No condiment available in the facility could disguise what it was. It showed up on trays multiple times a week, month after month, year after year. Some inmates refused to eat it and went without protein for the day. Most did not have that luxury. Number 22. Cold congealed oatmeal. Breakfast at Rikers arrived early, often before 5 in the morning. The flagship item was oatmeal, but by the time it reached the housing units, it had cooled into a thick gray mass that held the shape of the ladle. No sugar was provided, no butter, no milk on the side. Former inmates described using the back of a spoon to try to break it apart, pressing down hard enough to bend the plastic utensil. Some mixed in hot water from the unit sink just to make it soft enough to swallow. Others skipped breakfast entirely and went hungry until lunch, which was still hours away. The oatmeal was supposed to be the warm start to the day. What arrived was closer to wet cement. Number 21. Rubber eggs. The scrambled eggs served at Rikers were not cracked from a shell. They arrived as a liquid poured from large institutional cartons, then cooked on flat industrial griddles until they formed dense, rubbery sheets. These sheets were cut into squares and placed on trays. They bounced. That is not a figure of speech. Former correction staff confirmed that the egg squares could be dropped on the floor and land intact without breaking apart. The taste was described as somewhere between cardboard and sulfur, with a texture that required real effort to chew. On some mornings, this was the only protein on the tray. The eggs were technically eggs, but they bore no resemblance to anything a person on the outside would recognize by that name. Number 20. Stale bread as the main course. At Rikers, bread was not a side dish. It was frequently the most substantial thing on the tray. White bread, sliced thin, pulled from bulk deliveries that prioritized volume over freshness. It was served at breakfast. It was served at lunch. It appeared again at dinner. When the main protein ran short, which happened more often than the city ever acknowledged publicly, extra slices of bread were placed on the tray to fill the empty space. 2 slices became 4. 4 became 6. Some inmates reported receiving trays where bread was the only solid food present, with nothing beside it except a smear of margarine and a drink. Bread was cheap. Bread was always available. And at Rikers, bread was the answer to every shortage. Number 19. Green chicken. Of all the food complaints that came out of Rikers over the decades, this one surfaced again and again with a consistency that made it impossible to dismiss. Chicken served with a visible green tint to the skin. Not the natural darker shade of a thigh or drumstick. Not a seasoning artifact or a trick of the fluorescent lighting. Green. Former detainees described peeling back the breading on a fried chicken piece and finding flesh underneath that had changed color entirely. A dull grayish green that no amount of cooking should have produced. The smell confirmed what the eyes already suspected. It was the unmistakable smell of meat that had turned sharp and sour, cutting through the grease and the breading and the institutional air of the housing unit. Inmates who brought the chicken to the attention of corrections staff were routinely told it was safe to eat. Some were told to file a grievance if they had a complaint. The grievance forms, when they were available at all, went into a system that moved slowly and rarely produced visible results. When advocacy groups and city investigators began looking more closely at the food supply chain feeding Rikers, they found that meat deliveries were sometimes held in cold storage facilities well past their labeled use-by dates before being shipped to the jail kitchens for preparation. Chicken that should have been pulled from inventory and discarded was instead thawed, seasoned, breaded, fried at high temperature, and placed on trays. The facility maintained that reaching proper internal cooking temperatures rendered the product safe for consumption regardless of its appearance, texture, or odor. The people who had to sit on their bunks and decide whether to eat it or go hungry saw the situation very differently. Oversight bodies documented formal complaints about discolored poultry at Rikers that spanned not months but years, and the pattern repeated itself with depressing regularity. Complaints were filed, official responses were issued, promises of improved inspection were made, and then nothing changed. The green chicken kept appearing on trays, week after week, season after season. It became one of the most recognized symbols of what had gone fundamentally wrong inside the Rikers kitchen system. A quiet proof that cost savings had won completely and permanently over the basic human dignity of feeding people food that at minimum looked and smelled like food. Number 18. The maggot tray. Inmates and former staff both confirmed instances where food trays arrived with visible larvae in the food. Maggots, small and white, burrowed into bread rolls, sat on the surface of rice, and were once photographed crawling across a serving of canned vegetables. The images made their way into legal filings and news coverage. Rikers officials attributed the incidents to isolated lapses in pest control. But for the person sitting on a metal bunk staring down at a living creature moving through their dinner, the word isolated carried no weight. The tray was all they had. They could eat around the maggots or they could go hungry. Those were the choices. Number 17. The lockdown bag meal. When Rikers went into facility-wide lockdown, the kitchens shut down entirely. No trays were prepared, no serving lines were opened. Instead, correction officers handed out brown paper bags through the cell doors. Inside each bag was a cheese sandwich on white bread, a small piece of fruit, and sometimes a packet of cookies. That was breakfast. That was lunch. That was dinner. During extended lockdowns lasting several days, inmates received the same brown bag for every single meal. The cheese was cold and stuck to the bread. The fruit was bruised. The bread was dry. Former detainees described eating the same cheese sandwich 6, 8, 10 times in a row without any variation. Some lockdowns stretched on for nearly a week. Others were shorter but came so frequently that the brown bag became a regular feature of life at Rikers. It was not a meal, it was a placeholder, and it was all anyone got. Number 16. Food tainted with cleaning chemicals. Rikers kitchens used industrial cleaning agents to sanitize countertops, cooking surfaces, and serving equipment. The problem was timing. Trays and pots were sometimes put back into use before the chemicals had been fully rinsed away. Inmates described biting into food that tasted like bleach. Others reported a sharp chemical burn at the back of the throat after swallowing soup or drinking from cups that had been improperly washed. Complaints were filed. Grievances were submitted. The response was almost always the same. Nothing changed. The food kept coming. The chemical taste kept showing up. Some inmates learned to sniff their trays before eating, pressing their noses close to the surface of the food to check for that telltale sharp scent. If they caught it, they pushed the tray away and went hungry. If they did not catch it, they found out the hard way. Number 15. Cockroach garnish. Rikers sat on an island in the East River, surrounded by water on all sides and built largely on landfill. The facility had a cockroach population that no amount of extermination ever fully controlled. Roaches found their way into the kitchens, across serving lines, and directly into the food that landed on trays. Former inmates described finding them pressed flat into slices of bread, floating belly up in soup, and tucked beneath slices of cheese as if they had crawled in before the tray was assembled. Some inmates simply flicked the insect aside and kept eating. After long enough at Rikers, finding a cockroach in your food stopped being an event. It became part of the meal. Number 14. Nutriloaf. This was not just bad food. This was food engineered to be bad. Nutriloaf, sometimes called the disciplinary loaf or simply the brick, was a dense block of compressed ingredients served to inmates housed in solitary confinement, or those who had been classified as disruptive. The recipe varied from facility to facility, but the version served at Rikers typically combined bread, vegetables, beans, and sometimes a dairy component into a single mass that was baked until it solidified. There was no seasoning added to it. There was no discernible flavor. The texture was dense and chalky, and it stuck to the roof of the mouth in a way that made swallowing an effort. It met the minimum caloric and nutritional standards required by law, and that was the entire design philosophy. It was never meant to nourish in any recognizable human sense of the word. It was meant to remove the last small comfort a person in isolation had left, the experience of eating something that resembled a meal. Courts across the country spent years debating whether serving Nutriloaf to inmates constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Legal opinions split. Some jurisdictions moved to ban it outright. Others upheld its use. At Rikers, it persisted. Inmates who received Nutriloaf described the experience in terms that went beyond taste. They described it as eating hopelessness, 1 loaf per meal, 3 meals a day, sometimes for a week or longer. When a person's only remaining connection to the world outside their cell was a narrow slot in a steel door, and the only thing that came through that slot was Nutriloaf, the message being sent was unmistakable: you are not worth the effort of feeding like a human being. Number 13. Sour fruit. Fresh fruit was technically listed on the Rikers menu rotation. In practice, what arrived on trays bore little resemblance to anything you would pick up in a grocery store. Apples came with brown spots that covered more surface area than the remaining skin. Oranges had gone dry and hollow inside, the segments pulling away from the rind. Bananas arrived so overripe they were nearly liquid inside the peel. Inmates who wanted any source of vitamins had to eat whatever showed up or go without entirely. There was no alternative on the tray. There was no substitution available. You took the fruit they handed you, or you received no fruit at all. Number 12. The canned vegetable slurry. Vegetables appeared on the Rikers tray several times a week, but they never arrived fresh. They came from enormous institutional cans, pre-cooked and packed in brine. The kitchen heated them in bulk, and by the time they reached the tray, they had been sitting in warming pans long enough to lose whatever shape or color they once had. Green beans turned gray. Carrots dissolved into soft orange fragments. Mixed vegetables melted together into a single, undifferentiated mass with a texture closer to baby food than to anything a grown adult would choose to eat. The liquid pooled beneath the pile, thin and cloudy, carrying a faint metallic taste from the can. Inmates pushed the vegetables to the side of the tray. Most did not touch them at all. The ones who did ate them only because there was nothing else. Number 11. Trays still dirty from the last shift. The dishwashing operation at Rikers ran on volume, not precision. Trays were collected after each meal, run through industrial washing machines, and stacked for immediate reuse. But the machines did not always clean them properly. Inmates described receiving trays with dried food still crusted onto the surface, streaks of old gravy, a smear of something dark and unidentifiable in the corner, bits of rice stuck in the grooves. Some trays came back still wet with greasy water that smelled sour. There was no option to send a tray back. There was no clean replacement waiting. The food was placed directly onto whatever surface came through the line. Inmates who complained were told to wipe the tray with a napkin. Others simply ate off the cleanest section they could find and tried not to think about what had been there before. Number 10. Fish Fridays. Every Friday, the trays at Rikers held a piece of breaded fish. The fillet, if it could be called that, was thin, flat, and composed almost entirely of breading. The actual fish underneath was translucent and barely thicker than a playing card. It carried a strong odor that filled the entire housing unit the moment the food carts rolled through the door. Former inmates described the taste as old grease layered over something that may have once come from the ocean, but had long since given up any claim to freshness. The breading was the only part with texture. The fish inside dissolved on the tongue into something closer to paste than protein. Number 9. Watered-down juice. The beverage served with most meals at Rikers was a fruit-flavored drink that bore no resemblance to actual juice. It was mixed from powder concentrate in enormous vats and diluted well beyond what the package instructions called for in order to stretch supplies across the facility. The result was a faintly tinted liquid that tasted like sugar water with a chemical edge that caught in the back of the throat. Inmates referred to it as bug juice. It came in rotating colors, but they all tasted nearly identical. It arrived warm more often than cold, and for some inmates, it was the only source of hydration beyond the metallic tap water that came from the unit sink. Number 8. Recycled leftovers. At Rikers, uneaten food from one meal had a reliable way of reappearing at the next. The chicken served at Tuesday dinner resurfaced, chopped into Wednesday's soup. The rice from lunch reappeared under a different sauce at dinner. Former kitchen workers described being instructed to save everything that came back on the carts, store it, reheat it, and serve it again under a new name on the next day's menu. The appearance changed, the flavor shifted, the texture deteriorated, but the food itself kept cycling through the system, sometimes reappearing across multiple days before it was finally consumed or discarded. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was fresh. Number 7. The medical diet tray. Inmates with diabetes, heart conditions, severe allergies, or other documented medical needs were supposed to receive specialized meals carefully tailored to their health requirements. On paper, this was the system functioning exactly as intended, the one corner of the Rikers food operation where individual needs were supposed to matter. In practice, what arrived on the medical diet tray was often significantly worse than what the general population received. The medical diet at Rikers typically meant dramatically smaller portions stripped of anything that might constitute flavor or comfort. Unseasoned boiled vegetables served lukewarm, plain white rice with no sauce, no seasoning, and no visible effort. A piece of dry baked chicken breast with the skin peeled away and absolutely nothing added to compensate. No salt, no sugar, no butter, no substitution of any kind, regardless of what the inmate requested or what a reasonable cook might have done to make the food palatable. Inmates placed on medical diets reported losing alarming amounts of weight over the course of weeks because the trays simply did not contain enough total calories to sustain a grown adult through 3 meals a day. The portions were so small that some inmates described finishing the entire tray in under 5 minutes and spending the rest of the evening hungry. Some of them eventually made the deliberate and fully conscious decision to stop requesting the medical diet altogether. They asked for the regular tray instead, accepting whatever health consequences came with eating food their own doctors had explicitly told them to avoid, because the alternative was slowly wasting away on portions that left them dizzy and lightheaded by mid-afternoon. It was a choice between 2 kinds of harm, and they chose the one that at least came with enough food to function. Advocacy organizations that investigated conditions inside Rikers documented specific cases where inmates with diabetes received meal trays containing items with sugar content that directly and measurably contradicted their documented medical restrictions, while inmates who had formerly reported serious food allergies through the proper channels were handed trays containing the exact ingredients they had identified as dangerous to their health. The medical diet was designed to be the one visible proof that the facility recognized inmates as individuals with specific needs. Instead, it became one of the clearest and most damning demonstrations that it did not. Number 6. Expired food from storage. City investigators examining the Rikers food supply chain found items that had been stored well beyond their labeled expiration dates and then sent to the kitchens for preparation anyway. Canned goods sitting on shelves with lids that had begun to bulge outward. Frozen meat covered in freezer burn so severe the surface had turned white and papery. Packages of dried goods infested with pantry moths that scattered when the boxes were opened. The kitchens operated under enormous pressure to keep per-meal costs as low as possible while feeding thousands of people every single day, and the result was a storage and rotation system where expiration dates functioned as loose suggestions rather than firm rules. Number 5. The soy everything. To cut costs further, Rikers replaced real meat with soy-based substitutes across a wide range of dishes on the menu. Soy crumbles appeared in the chili. Soy patties replaced beef at lunch. Soy protein was blended into what the menu still labeled as beef stew. The texture of all of it was uniform and rubbery, and the soy absorbed whatever liquid it sat in without ever developing a distinct flavor of its own. Inmates who ate these meals for weeks and months at a stretch described a flatness to every tray, a sameness that made it genuinely impossible to tell Tuesday's dinner from Thursday's based on taste alone. On paper, the facility hit its required protein targets per meal. On the tongue, something fundamental was absent. Number 4. Rat-contaminated prep areas. Rikers had a rat problem, and it extended directly into the spaces where food was prepared and stored. Corrections officers and kitchen workers both reported seeing rats in the dry storage rooms, running across stainless steel prep counters after the lights went off and leaving droppings on surfaces that would be used for cooking the following morning. Health inspections conducted over the years documented evidence of rodent activity in food preparation areas on multiple occasions. The meals that came out of those kitchens each day were assembled, seasoned, and plated on the same surfaces that rats had crossed hours earlier. Cleaning protocols existed. Whether they were sufficient to address what was living in those walls was another question entirely. Number 3. The shrinking tray. Over the years, the portions served at Rikers got noticeably smaller. Inmates who served multiple stints at the facility noticed the difference immediately. Advocacy organizations that tracked conditions inside the complex documented it. The protein servings shrank. The vegetable portions shrank. The bread count stayed roughly the same because bread was the cheapest item on the tray, but everything else was quietly and steadily reduced in size. Budget pressures from the city and contract renegotiations with food service providers meant that each tray cost less to produce, and the people eating those trays received less on them with each passing year. Some detainees reported feeling genuinely hungry within an hour of finishing what was supposed to be a full meal. Hunger at Rikers was not an accident or an oversight. It was a budget decision. Number 2. The food slot meal. Inmates housed in solitary confinement at Rikers received their food through a narrow rectangular slot cut into a steel door. The tray was pushed through, and the slot was immediately closed and locked. There was no table in many of these cells. In some, there was no chair. The person ate sitting on the concrete floor or balanced on the edge of a metal cot, alone, in a space barely large enough to take 3 steps in any direction. The food itself was the same as what the general population received on a good day, or Nutriloaf on a bad one. But the experience of eating it was something entirely different from any other meal served anywhere in the facility. No human face, no conversation, no sound except the tray scraping through the slot and the lock clicking shut behind it. Meal after meal. Day after day, for weeks, sometimes months. Number 1. The skipped meal. The most shocking meal at Rikers was the one that never came. Inmates across multiple housing units and across multiple decades reported entire meals being skipped without warning, without explanation, and without any attempt to make up for what was lost. A tray that was supposed to arrive at noon simply did not appear. No announcement was made over the intercom. No corrections officer came to the cell door to explain the delay or offer an alternative. The meal just did not happen. Lockdowns triggered by security incidents elsewhere in the complex, chronic staff shortages that left entire housing wings without enough corrections, officers present to supervise the distribution of food carts, and plain administrative failures where one shift assumed the previous shift had already handled it, all contributed to meals being delayed by hours or canceled outright with no recovery plan. When thousands of human beings are locked inside individual cells, with no way to leave and depend entirely on the institution holding them to provide every single calorie they consume in a day, a skipped meal is not a scheduling hiccup. It is not an inconvenience. It is deprivation carried out through institutional neglect, one tray at a time. Former detainees described going stretches of a full day or longer without receiving any food at all, trapped in a setting where there was no vending machine down the corridor, no refrigerator in the housing unit, no commissary window open at that hour, and no physical ability to walk outside and buy something or ask a neighbor for help. Just a locked cell, an empty food slot and a steel door, and the slow, grinding realization that no one was on their way. City oversight reports and independent monitors confirmed that failures in meal delivery at Rikers were not rare or isolated events but recurring, well-documented patterns that persisted stubbornly across years of official monitoring and reform promises. The most shocking thing that Rikers Island ever served to its prisoners was nothing at all. 25 meals. Some were barely food, some were punishment dressed up as nutrition, and some never showed up at all. If you made it through this entire list, drop a comment and tell us which one shocked you the most. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time because there is a lot more history like this on the way. Thank you for watching.